Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling something that, well, feels incredibly urgent, these escalating global crises. War in Europe, the Middle East, talk of conflict with China. There's this real sense of unease everywhere.
It definitely feels like a precarious moment. That unease is palpable.
And it's starkly highlighted by the doomsday clock, right? 89 seconds to midnight. I mean, that's the closest it's ever been since, what, 1947?
That's right. A stark reminder of just how high the stakes are. It frames the whole discussion, really.
Absolutely. So our deep dive today, it centers on a recent conversation Professor Jeffrey Sachs had on the Glenn Deason YouTube channel. Our mission, essentially, is to unpack Sachs's view on what's driving us towards, well, some people, like Steve Banner, actually calling it World War III.
And also, why isn't there more real diplomacy happening? That seems to be a core question Sachs raises. Where's the genuine negotiation?
Exactly. We're going to look critically at how power dynamics, leadership choices, and history have brought us here. And importantly, what this precarious situation means for you listening.
So, where does Sachs start? He paints a picture of a very dangerous time, doesn't he? Marked by these fundamental disruptions.
He does. He really emphasizes this big geopolitical shift. He traces it from, the Cold War, bipolar world, U.S. versus Soviet Union, 45 to 91.
Right. Then that period after 91, the sort of supposed unipolar moment with the U.S. on top.
Supposed is the key word there,
Okay.
according to Sachs, because he argues very firmly that we are now clearly in a multipolar world. But the key isn't just that it's multipolar.
It's that this new setup, this multipolar landscape, U.S., China, Russia, India, maybe Europe, if it gets its act together, it completely lacks shared norms. There's no common vision, no agreed-upon rules of the road.
And that's where the danger lies,
Yeah.
in part. It's a structure without a framework.
Precisely. And Sachs argues that within this vacuum, the West, mainly the U.S., is trying really hard to cling to its old primacy, trying to maintain dominance over China, Russia, the BRICS nations.
It sounds like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole almost. A unipolar mindset in this new multipolar reality.
That seems to be his point. And then he layers on top of that these other huge compounding factors.
Right, you mentioned disruptions, like what?
Well, he points directly to climate change. Widespread climate disasters, he mentions huge floods in China, those massive forest fires near Los Angeles, as adding another layer of global instability.
Okay, so geopolitical shifts, climate crisis. What else?
Leadership. He gives a really scathing critique of what he calls the dismal quality of Western leadership right now.
Yeah, he doesn't hold back on U.S. leadership, does he? Talking about Donald Trump.
He characterizes Trump as unstable, unpredictable, transactional, lacking any long-term view, and filled with, I think the phrase was, delusions of U.S. power. A real disconnect from reality, Sachs suggests.
And his view on European leadership, is it any better?
Equally stark, frankly. He sees Europe in a progressive state of open collapse politically. He even calls Ursula von der Leyen a disgrace.
A disgrace. Why?
For accepting U.S. diktats, as he puts it basically, taking orders particularly in trade negotiations. He implies Europe got a really raw deal, undermining its own sovereignty.
Wow. Okay, so big picture shifts, climate, leadership problems, and he connects this to specific crises too, right? Like Gaza.
Oh, absolutely. He's unequivocal. He describes Israel's actions in Gaza using the term genocide. Very strong language.
That is incredibly strong.
And he directly implicates the U.S. and Europe, saying they have aided and abetted it. So when you put all that together, the power shifts, the climate, the leadership vacuum he describes, these horrific events.
Yeah, you can see why that doomsday clock is ticking so close to midnight. It paints a pretty grim picture.
It does, and it leads to the question, how did Europe, which seemed to have a clear post-war path, end up here, according to Sachs?
That's a really crucial part of his analysis. He looks back at Europe after World War II, after that unimaginable calamity. He says Europe consciously chose a different way forward.
Based on peace, cooperation, building a community, which became the European community, then the EU.
Exactly. And he points to examples of Europe acting independently back then.
Right.
Like Willy Brandt in West Germany with his Ostpolitik.
Right. Reaching out to the East, trying to build bridges with the Soviet Union, that whole vision of a peaceful European home from Rotterdam to Vladivostok, a truly pan-European idea.
And Sachs himself, he says he really believed in that. He was involved in the early 90s, advising governments, hoping for this new, inclusive EU, one that wouldn't just, as he put it, move the Berlin Wall a few hundred kilometers to the east and exclude Russia.
A missed opportunity, perhaps? So what went wrong? Why did that vision derail? Sachs points to two big things.
Okay, what's the first one?
U.S. leadership after 1991, he argues it became completely delusional and arrogant, this idea of being the sole superpower, the world's policeman.
And he blames specific groups for this.
He uses the term neocons, linking them to the CIA and what he calls the deep state, basically an entrenched establishment pushing for U.S. dominance, in his view.
Okay, that's factor one, U.S. delusion. What's the second?
Europe's role. He says Europe basically fell into line. It lost its independence streak.
He mentions a kind of last gasp of independence, though, doesn't it?
Yeah, he points to 2003 Germany and France opposing the U.S. invasion of Iraq. He sees that as maybe the last significant stand.
Before what? What was the turning point?
He identifies the 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest. That's when NATO formally committed to eventual membership for Ukraine and Georgia.
And Sachs sees that
As the predicate, the
Yeah.
setup for the war in Ukraine today, unequivocally. He says Europe, even Merkel initially, resisted but ultimately folded its hand. And in his view, Europe hasn't been independent ever since.
So fast forward to today. What's his assessment of European politics now? You said it was stark.
Extremely. He calls current German chancellors pathetic, EU leaders vassals of the United States.
Vassals. Again, really strong language.
Yeah, and he uses that recent trade agreement where he claims Europe gave everything to the United States as Exhibit A for this loss of independence, proof that Europe's not acting in its own best interests anymore.
And this ties into the rhetoric around Russia, too.
Definitely. He argues that European discourse, partly steered by this U.S. deep state he mentions, became insanely Russophobic.
Insanely Russophobic. What does he mean by that?
He means it prevents any real, honest conversation about the causes of the Ukraine war. Things like NATO enlargement, which we just discussed, or the West, as he puts it, dissing and dumping the Minsk Agreement, those peace deals for eastern Ukraine.
Right, the Minsk Accords.
Or the U.S. refusal to discuss limits on anti-ballistic missile systems near Russia. He gets really frustrated, saying anyone who even brings these points up gets instantly shut down as a Putin apologist.
So it's created an environment where certain topics are just off limits for discussion.
That's his argument. And he connects this to Europe's commitment after the Cold War to what he calls liberal hegemony.
Liberal hegemony. What's that, basically?
The idea that Western liberal democracy and its institutions should be the dominant global model. He thinks this commitment now leaves Europe in a panic in this new multipolar world, leading to complete subservience to the U.S.
And the consequence.
Isolation. Europe's cutting itself off from Russia, damaging ties with China. And in doing so, losing its own leverage, becoming more dependent. It's backing Europe more and more into this pathetic state of affairs, as he puts it. A diminished voice.
Okay, it's a bleak assessment of Europe.
Yeah.
So, given all this, what kind of advice does Sachs offer, hypothetically, to a U.S. leader like Trump if they wanted to change course?
Well, the first thing he stresses is the U.S. cannot dictate terms anymore. He really slams what he sees as Trump's incredible arrogance of power and those kinds of ineffective ultimatums, like saying he'll solve the Ukraine war in 10 days or whatever.
Right. The idea that the U.S. can just impose solutions seems outdated in this multipolar view.
Exactly. And interestingly, Sachs claims Trump privately understood that NATO enlargement was a provocation.
Privately, but...
But Sachs thinks he was too weak to actually say it publicly or act on it. He argues a real leader would need to be honest publicly state, NATO will not enlarge as a foundation for peace in Ukraine.
And also acknowledge past mistakes.
Yes, acknowledge that the West should not have dissed the Minsk II agreement, that honesty is crucial for building trust, he implies.
He also makes a distinction between just stopping the fighting and real peace, right?
A really important one. A ceasefire, he says, just pauses the violence temporarily. Russia, he argues, rightly wants a genuine peace agreement that tackles the root causes of conflict, aiming for long-term collective security so it doesn't just flare up again.
That makes sense. What about the Middle East, then? What's his prescription there? We touched on his description of Israel's actions.
Yes, and his proposed U.S. response is just as blunt. He says the U.S. must stop arming and funding Israel, period. Full stop. And demand a two-state solution. There's no ambiguity in his stance there.
It's incredibly direct. Does he explain why he thinks U.S. policy is the way it is? He seems baffled by it.
He openly says he struggles to understand the hold of this madness on U.S. politics, especially regarding the Middle East. He speculates about the influence of the Zionist lobby.
What kind of influences does he mention?
He throws out possibilities like money of donors, the role of Protestant evangelical voters. He even mentions, though stressing these are speculative and unproven, things like potential blackmail by Mossad on the Epstein list. It shows how much he's searching for an explanation for what he sees as irrational policy.
So he's really trying to grapple with why the U.S. pursues these policies he sees as so dangerous.
Yeah, he sees the U.S. as continually doubling down on paths that increase risk, and he's trying to understand the political mechanics behind it.
So boiling it all down, what's the core message from Sachs for avoiding disaster?
It really comes down to rejecting arrogance and embracing diplomacy. He says the U.S. belief that it can just settle the terms with everyone. The Middle East, Iran, Russia, China is completely dangerous and delusional in today's world.
This is not a unipolar world anymore.
Exactly. And he brings up the stark reality. There are 9 nuclear powers now. A nuclear war isn't just a U.S.-Russia thing anymore. It could end everything and start almost anywhere.
The terrifying thought.
Which makes his core principle even more urgent. We need diplomacy. Real diplomacy based on honesty, directness, and crucially mutual respect among major powers. Otherwise, we risk catastrophe.
He uses a historical parallel too, right? About ultimatums.
Yeah, the Habsburg Empire's ultimatum to Serbia before World War I, he uses it as a cautionary tale against issuing non-negotiable demands today. It's a recipe for conflict, not resolution.
It really brings us back to that opening question, doesn't it? Are we in World War III already? Or just the lead up? He mentions others have asked this.
Right. He notes Pope Francis said something similar years before Steve Bannon. So it's a feeling that's been building for a while.
Does he think it's like the 1930s again?
He uses that comparison, yeah, cautioning that history doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes. The specific circumstances are different, but the level of danger today is undoubted, in his words. We're in a very uncertain, risky period.
He closes with a quote, doesn't he? Something about the old world dying.
Yeah, a really powerful quote from Antonio Gramsci. The old world is dying and the new world cannot be born, and it's within this interregnum that this morbid symptoms appear.
Morbid symptoms.
Right?
That sounds like our current crises, instability, lack of direction. We're stuck in between.
That's exactly how he frames it. We're in this chaotic transitional period. But importantly, he doesn't end on pure despair.
Oh, there's some hope.
A cautious hope. He believes a new world based on multilateralism can be born, but it won't just happen. We have to actively midwife it, he says. It requires conscious effort, difficult choices, steering away from those morbid symptoms.
So recapping this deep dive into Sachs's analysis, we've seen this huge shift to a multipolar world, his sharp critique of Western leadership failing to adapt, the decline of genuine diplomacy.
And the urgent need for a totally new approach, one based on respect, honesty, dealing with root causes if we want to avoid, well, what he calls global suicide.
The alternative is incredibly grim. So the final thought for you, listening. In a world crying out for diplomacy, as Sachs argues, what difference can our awareness make? Can demanding different leadership actually help midwife that new multilateral world he hopes for?
Or do we just succumb to the morbid symptoms? How does understanding these dynamics, this analysis from Sachs, help push towards real peace instead of just doubling down on arrogance?
Something important to think about, definitely.